Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at puremtgo.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Mythicast. I am your host, Spencer, and I'm joined by my co-host, Michaela. How did you do yesterday in your charity event?
I had a great stream. I surpassed my personal goal for fundraising, which was awesome, and really really exciting to be able to, join Extra Life Game Day and do something good for the community outside of Magic.
Yeah, I really appreciated that you were doing that. I thought it was really cool, and if people get the chance to donate to a good cause, I always encourage them to do so. But we are not here to talk about that today. Actually, today, because we're going to talk about one of your favorite decks in Standard, Blue White Blink, which is really exciting. Before we do, just want to mention our sponsor over at puremtgo.com. Don't forget to check them out. And I just want to quickly announce on this podcast, because I forgot to announce it last week, that we are actually doing an additional contest in the Heezy Game Media Discord. Heezy Game Media is my little parent media company over the Constructive Criticism Network and Heezy Game Media. And in our Discord, we have contests for some Magic-related stuff. So we have a contest for, right now, it's 3 different channels. One of them is the Pauper channel, where if you post a 4-1 or better Pauper deck list, you get entered. A standard one, where if you post your Mythic deck list or a trophy deck, you get entered. And now also we're doing one in our limited channel for deck lists, where if you post a trophy deck, you get entered, and every entry goes into a pool, and then it's like a raffle. We pull one out, and the winner each month in each of those channels gets $20 to Pure MTGO sponsor over at mtgotraders.com. So if you want to participate in those contests, the link to the Discord is in the show notes. And yeah, I'm excited to kind of, give people a chance to both show off the things that they're doing, talk about Magic more, and give a little bit back. And that new contest is brought to you by this podcast, and that's pretty exciting. So, cool.
Some good stuff.
Go ahead.
Oh, I think it's great to get the community involved and just, give some other people a spotlight of their successes.
I think so too. And, that's kind of what this podcast is all about when it started, right? Is inviting Mythic players on. I know that Michaela and I will be talking either this week or next week kind of about, the next month or so of shows and kind of the show types moving forward. And it's really exciting to both get to, when you think about Mythicast and what we've done in the past, it is taking players who achieve Mythic and giving them a chance to talk about their experience. And, the Discord is just another place that, you can show the things that you're doing and get rewarded for that. So with that being said, Michaela, let's talk about Blue White Blink. So I actually want to kick this off pretty interestingly, because typically, on these style of episodes, I do deck techs with people when they get Mythic, but I would like to do a real deep dive on this deck. And I'd like to just throw spoilers out right up front. We're not going to make people wait. Where do you think the Blue White Blink deck stands in the standard format?
So, if you're the person who's out there and you're like, I want to play the absolute best deck in standard, I don't think Blue White Blink is that deck right now. I think it's a very fun, interesting deck to play that has a lot of lines. It's a deck that does have game against, a good majority of the decks in the format. Rogues can be a little bit tough, but once you understand the game plan, it gets a little bit better for you. And so, if this is the style of deck that you like to play, if you like to lean towards a little bit more of a control style of deck, if you like a deck that has, really a lot of options and you just feel you like having that toolbox, this is a great deck to pick.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's interesting to me, I played 15-20 matches with this deck this weekend, and I played both the version that we're going to talk about, your deck list that you played at the the qualifier yesterday, as well as the list that Zach Allen had a YouTube video on. I got the chance to talk to some people about the deck, and for me, Michaela, I think that this deck definitely. I mean, you call it its biggest weakness. I think it struggles against Rogue quite a bit. In fact, 6 of my first 8 matches with this deck were against Rogues, and I O2'd the first event that I played with it, O2ing against Rogues, and was like, whoa, this matchup is not what I expected. In that time, I was playing Zach Allen's list. It can be rough, but I think that one of the cool things about these blue-white decks, and something that surprised me, is at least the list that you sent me, this deck has evolved quite a bit still to keep up in the metagame. And so if you're looking at a list from 3 weeks ago, I think it's pretty different from a list that you might see today on these decks. The number of Omen of the Suns is down. The number of, the list that we're going to talk about today, for example, has no Charming Princes in it. So, there's a lot of evolution that's come in this deck.
Yeah, for sure. My take on like a card like a Charming Prince or Omen of the Sun, that's where you're really relying on that blink element of the deck and trying to just keep, getting that continuous value and loop the combo over and over. The way I play the deck is a little bit more of a control style, and just be able to like reuse these resources that I've originally cast to keep advancing my board state and control the opponent's side of the board.
The next question that I think we should talk about is, we talk about how it's not the best deck in the format. I think it's got some problems with rogues. I think depending on how you build it, you can suffer against certain draws against, I think more so Gruul or Golgari than mono green. But at least on the 2-color Lovestruck Beasts, they can have game plans against you. I think Golgari a little bit more so because it gets discard, but with 2 of the first deck being, oh man, I wish I had looked at that percentage that we had before, but I think it's closer than Rogues. Does this deck have room in this metagame to gain metagame share?
I think if we see Rogues fall off, that's definitely a place where it can gain some metagame share. And I think we're already maybe seeing a little bit of that in some places. I know in my qualifier run yesterday, I did not run into Rogues at all, which was, I ran into it twice the previous time. And, mono green is a deck that I think we're starting to see a little bit more of an increase in, because it is good against those Gruul decks that we're seeing pop up in a large percentage in tournaments right now. And, I think that's a deck that this blue-white blink deck can really take advantage of.
Yeah, me too. I think that if you start to see a streamlined diversification, so right now the green decks are kind of like, there's lots of different green decks, but they all have similar game plans. But if you start to see like 2 green decks and the Rogues deck lose metagame share, I agree with you. I think that blue-white can gain some metagame share. I actually also this week got a little kick out of actually building just a 60-card blue-white deck, no Urions, and that deck did quite well for me. And I do think that like the blue-white shell of some kind definitely has room to gain metagame percentages. It is really hard when the blue-black control deck is like plays a control game and a tempo game. And one of the things that I noticed is, and I don't know if you've had this experience too, like I played against the Vantress Gargoyle?
Yes.
Yeah, the Vantress Gargoyle versions. I played against the Luris versions. I played against the Reduke version. Whether it's crabs, no crabs, and it's funny. The first game that I played with this deck, my opponent went turn 1 crab, turn 2 crab fetch land, turn 3 crab fetch land, and I was like, what in the world? And then they ended up playing all 3 fetch lands with 4 crabs in play. I was like, that was a beating. It was a lot. But I do think that this deck, while Rose is rough, I didn't go winless against that deck. Like in those, I went 2-4 in those first 6, and then I actually beat it the next time I played it. Also, as I learned the matchup, so it is not impossible to beat the deck, and I don't want us to overstate how rough that matchup is. But I agree with you. I think that this deck, it has a lot of good cards in the color combination. And we kind of talked about it last week, but it's not like you would have to stay blue-white. Like in certain metagames, like you could add green, you could add red. I mean, obviously we know how well Esper did, right? And so there's a lot to be gained.
Oh yeah, for sure. You mentioned those color combinations. Just yesterday I saw Mike Brill took a 4-color version of a Yorion deck that was more Mardu based, but was splashing a blue for a couple cards. So there's a lot to be explored with this style.
Yeah, let's pull up the deck list really quick, and Michaela, I will actually have you read it really quick.
You just want me to read off all the cards that are in the list?
Yeah.
Okay.
It might take a while. It's an 80 card deck, but yeah, if you could read the deck list for the listeners at home, I think that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So the version of Blue White Yorion that I have been running, and it consists of 4 Glass Casket, 4 The Birth of Meletus, 3 Essence Scatter, 2 Negate, 4 Omen of the Sun, 4 Maze Mind Tome, 1 Omen of the Sun, 4 Skyclave Apparition, 1 Glass Pool Mimic, 2 Thirst for Meaning, 2 Neutralize, 4 Shatter the Sky, 4 Elspeth Conquers Death, 3 Yorion Sky Nomad, 3 Shark Typhoon, 2 Dream Trawler, 4 Amaria's Call, and 1 Seagate Restoration.
And lands. You don't have to read out
lands, and also Yorion is in the companion slot.
Yeah.
And then the sideboard is going to consist of 3 Glimpse of Freedom, 2 Negate, 1 Mystical Dispute, 2 Felidar Retreat, 1 Baneslayer Angel, 1 Shark Typhoon, 1 Sublime Epiphany, and 1 Dream Trawler.
Awesome. So this is the deck list that you've been playing. I actually played. I think the only change from when you sent me it is you moved the Shatter to the main and moved the Mystical Dispute to the sideboard.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the main deck, and I want to talk specifically about the fact that we're playing 4 Shadow of the Skies, and we're also playing a Skyclave Apparition. But man, this deck, Skyclave Apparition, is like, I don't know what it is, but I like this so much better than some of the other creatures that had this effect. Like, I love that they get an elemental instead of their creature back. Or is it an elemental? It might be an illusion.
Yeah, I think it's an illusion.
But either way, like, holy crap, is this card good?
Oh, it's great. And there's just so many cool plays that you can have with this card. Against a card like Brushfire Elemental, or just a lot of the threats in Gruul, it really shuts down by only bringing back a token, the things that make those cards good. And since it comes back as the converter mana cost, that X is equal to converter mana cost for the creature power, that also is very valuable against those decks. And also like mono green decks where you're trying to play creatures that are more power and toughness than that mana cost would typically provide.
Oh, absolutely. Like, you kill a Lovestruck Beast with it, and they get a 3/3 back. It's like, yeah, okay. Like, you
and they don't even...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. You don't always even let them have the 3/3 back. Sometimes you're blinking that Skyclave Apparition and a Glass Casket, and then just taking the apparition on whatever was under the Glass Casket, and then taking the token. It's so great.
My favorite thing is when I get to do a Glass Casket on a token, because I know I'm going to Glass Casket again to get something else for free, and that is a good feeling.
Oh, yeah.
It's a good
100%.
I think the other thing, like, one of the things that I didn't realize that I was going to really appreciate about that card is just the number of times where I'm able to Skyclave Apparition, like, some 4 mana. Like, I've Skyclave Apparition Liliana. I've Skyclave Apparition, like, Planeswalkers. Tough to deal with permanents. I think it's the
Doom Foretold.
Yes, definitely that one. Just all kinds of stuff.
Solemn Simulacrum's not a terrible one to get.
Because then they don't get to draw the card. Yeah, I agree. The card just has a lot of utility while also just kind of fitting into your game plan really, really well. Mm-hmm. I want to talk about the mana really quick. So here is, I guess I'll be pretty honest about this deck's mana, and then I want your opinion. I I constantly wonder playing 2-color decks in this format if I should just be playing 3-color decks, because the mana feels so much worse for 2-color decks.
Yeah, and you, I can agree with that. I can't. My first round of playing this deck and testing it, I really didn't run into too many mana issues, and I was actually happier with the mana than I was with the 3-color decks. However, this past weekend of playing it, I started noticing that sometimes you don't have that second blue mana to, double spell or be able to cast the neutralize. You have a lot of lands coming into play tapped, and that can be very frustrating. I lost a game in the qualifier yesterday because I needed my fifth land to come into play untapped, and here I was just staring at tapped lands.
Yeah, I did have a question about the lands, because I think obviously the best land in this deck is actually a 7-mana spell that makes 2 angels. That card is it's funny. I did not realize how much of that card I would be playing, but I have put that card in a lot of deck lists. Why don't you talk to me about Amira's Call really quick?
This card has been exceptionally good for me. It can close out a game very, very fast. I've had some games against Gruul where it's like, okay, we got to close this game out in like 1 or 2 turns because they're possibly a top deck away from, finishing this out. And so, it provides me like 2 fairly good sized bodies on the board that block well against a deck like Gruul that's, making it difficult for your smaller creatures to block, and can also has the power to trample over very easily. But also makes your attacks a little bit better also, and can, if you happen to have a couple tokens on board or something, can make those really good blockers for the next turn.
Yeah, it's funny. Both it being a tap land or untap land, like depending on what I need, has been really good. And then I had a game against basically anytime Rogues taps out and you get the chance to resolve this card, it's actually really hard for them to beat 2/4/4 Angels, surprisingly enough. Like, especially because it gives your other stuff indestructible. I had a player tap out against me. I played this, and like I knew that they had a ton of removal spells and they were planning on winning the next turn, and that's why they tapped out. So I played this, and all my creatures were indestructible, and they're like, "Oh no!" And then I got to untap with all my counter spells, and they were just donezo.
Yep, 100%. And I think, not even just against Rogues. If you're playing against, like the Esper Doom deck or anything like that, when you get to force those decks to tap out and then you get to resolve something like this card, it can just turn a game so fast.
Yeah. One thing that I did notice is we only have one castle. We only have the one castle. Was there any thought for you? I know that the list I played with Zach Allens, he had quite a few of the White Castle, and then actually one of the Blue Castle Ventress also. The White Castle has been quite good for me in this deck. Just being able to put a 1/1 on the board at instant speed has saved me a lot of time, a lot of life. I have not killed anybody with 1/1s yet. I don't think that that's really what this deck does with that card, but it certainly clogs up the board pretty well.
Well, does making your 1/1s 3/3s count as killing someone with this card? Because I've done that.
How did you do that?
After bringing Felidar Retreat.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I really, really like the Castle Artemis in this deck. I could see going up to 2. Again, you run into that. It sometimes can be really hard to sequence your lands so that you have lands coming play untapped at the right times. So with that, you're really dependent on having that Triome or already having another planes.
Yeah, one of the things that Zach's list does for that, by the way, is he doesn't play any of the Tranquil Coves. He plays all the Fable Passages.
Okay. Yeah, and I can definitely I can see that as a reasonable change to try to just incorporate some of those lands that give you a little bit more value later in the game.
It's funny. I was thinking this. I don't know if it was. I mean, I thought it while playing this deck, but if those Mythics were also their basic land type on the land side, man, would that be sick.
Okay, hey, you know what? We cannot give that much power to Gruul, though. We can't do that.
Sure.
I feel, yeah, that would really benefit the aggro decks too. On top of.
That's fair. That's a good point. So kind of moving away from the man base. Like I said, I think we both agree that we're in a world where Wizards doesn't give us, just great mana overall anymore, and that's okay. That's okay. I think that you have a lot of things to mitigate that. How do you win with this deck? Like, what's the overall game plan?
So typically when I'm winning with this deck, it's a lot of times with the Dream Trawler. Usually that's just the card that finally puts the deck over the top. You're very comfortable attacking with it versus aggro, because usually you're getting enough life that you're not just dead on the backswing. A lot of times it's very difficult for your opponents to deal with. Rogues has a lot of trouble dealing with this card. They have a lot of removal, but not necessarily all their removal is instant speed. And especially if you can bring this back off an ACD in game one and it gets a +1/+1 counter, and they're a deck that runs Heartless Act, that's just one less card that can actually deal with this. So that's kind of my main way of winning. But sometimes you just get that Yorion out and you're able to just get your swings with that and close out the game that way. Your games that go longer, a Shark Typhoon cast as a enchantment can be very, very key.
I think it's really safe to say you win with flyers and value. Like, whether it's Shark Typhoon, whether it's Amiria's Call, whether it's a Yorion, whether it's a Dream Trawler, it is, I controlled the game and now I'm going to kill you with this big beefy flyer.
Oh yeah. It's flyers. You're evading, but every once in a while that Castle Ardenville can get there.
I had played less matches. I did win a game with Felidar Retreat out of the sideboard, though. I do think that is something that this list specifically can do pretty well. One of the things that I really liked about your list, I think that this deck, if it's going to be a Yorion deck, you should be playing Yorions in the main deck. Why don't you talk about that really quick?
Yeah. So, it's, yes, you have this guaranteed Yorion that you can get for 3 mana, but against a lot of decks, that's extremely difficult to have that turn to pay that 3 and then, be able to cast Yorion the next turn. So having these 3 Yorions in the main that are not in the companion slot that you can just draw and, be able to get that value that you really, really want to get on turn 5 against a more aggressive deck can be super key, and just, really take you from a game where your opponents put a ton of pressure on you and just eliminate a lot of the pressure on board, depending on your first couple plays of the game.
When looking at this deck, I want to talk about the key cards really quick. And I think we've obviously can talk about the companion slot. But I think that, I don't actually know that this deck would be, and you might laugh at me for saying this, but I don't know that this deck would be possible without Omen of the Sea. Like, I actually think it is one of the pivotal cards for this archetype existing.
I agree. The scry is huge. Just to the scry too. You're helping find, like, what's on top of my library, what is going to, what am I digging for in the deck, and being able to get that look at 3 extra cards that you wouldn't have been able to get for 2 mana is huge. It's kind of a card that allows you to make keeps that you wouldn't have maybe otherwise kept. Like, you can keep those 2 landers in this deck that really wants to hit its land drops and feel fairly comfortable with it.
I actually think maybe we should talk about all of the 2 drops as the key cards in this for what it's worth. As you're talking, I mean, this also applies to Birth of Meletus. This also applies to Mazemind Tome. Like, these 12 cards in your main deck are making up for the fact that you're playing this 80 card, what would be a pretty inconsistent deck. Like, people don't play 60 cards as the least like, I mean, we all know that Magic player who comes in with a 100 card deck to an FNM and they're really excited about it and they're confused as to why their deck's not working. And you're like, what you should be doing is playing the smallest deck you possibly can so that you draw your best cards more often. And Yorion just throws that out the window, right? I mean, we're playing an Omen of the Sun in this deck. Like, clearly we are making some concessions to get the benefit of playing Yorion. And the thing that Mazemind Tome, Omen of the Sea, and Birth of Meletus do is they're like, okay, that's fine. We're going to make our deck both air and, I mean, if you look at Mazemind Tome specifically, like, you also are just saying, no, we're going to slow this game down and I'm going to get some stuff. You mentioned the scry on Omen of the Sea. I found myself scrying a lot with Maze Mind Tome just while I'm tapped out, because putting either a land or a spell that I don't need on the bottom with this deck often felt like drawing a card. Like, I mean, there's so many cards in my deck, it's so easy to filter through the deck.
Oh yeah. And also on the scry with Maze Mind Tome when you're tapped out, I've found that actually really key especially versus your aggressive decks. Because you know that when that Maze Mind Tome goes away, and when after those 4 counters are put on it, you gain 4 life, and that can actually that's actually been the difference in a few games for me between winning and losing. The fact that I was able to scry for a few turns and position my deck so that I was drawing the cards that I actually want to be drawing and not drawing the cards that I don't want to be drawing in that moment. And then, that 4 life gain, just enough to swing it.
What would you say outside of those 2 drops? Like, what's the other key card of the main deck that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I really think you have to. Elspeth Conquers Death. It's obviously not a great card versus like a deck like Rogues, but the card really allows you to set up for some extremely powerful turns in the game where you've removed like a huge threat on their side, and then you've sequenced things in such a way where you're able to return a Yorion from your graveyard, you're able to return a Dream Trawler from your graveyard, and that kind of pairs with the Thirst for Meaning. I've definitely had a few plays where I've done the discard a Dream Troll off of the Thirst for Meeting and stat before
Me too.
before ECD goes off the next turn.
Yeah, I've done it during my upkeep too. Like, you untap, with the trigger on the stack, do it. It's a sick play. It's definitely one of my favorite interactions in decks like this. I'm glad you mentioned ECD. One of the things that ECD does in this deck specifically is it gives you protection, similarly to how we talked about Skyclave Apparition, but it gives you protection on the other side of Skyclave Apparition, right? Skyclave Apparition is going to deal with those hard to deal with things in front of you at the low CMC, and then you're covering your bases where ECD is going to deal with them at the other end. I mean, I think we probably both killed, 7, 8 for me, probably way more than that for you, Ugins with this card. Like, especially when you know your opponent's about to play Ugin, you're like, okay, how do I get my opponent to play their Ugin so that I can kill it now so that they're tapped out to do it? Like, it's a real thing I've thought with this deck. And, it also comes down and it takes out, just like the Skyclave version, it takes out Doom Foretold. It takes out, really, really key cards. If you get the chance, you can kill a Great Henge or a Embercleave with it. It certainly does a lot. It was really funny. Early on in this format, one of my friends told me that they think this card's really bad in this format. And I was like, I don't know if it's bad in this format. I think it's just bad against rogues. Like, that is one deck, and, that's why you have sideboard games.
Yeah, and even against rogues, it can be so dependent on the rogues build. I think there's a few rogues builds out there that are running a bunch of Shark Typhoons and trying to play this control game where they're trying to get that Shark Typhoon out as an enchantment. And they're also milling you. So maybe you do want to consider having that ECD in the situations. Not all 4 by any means.
No, absolutely not. No, I do think that, it's funny. There are games, if I see that my opponent has a Lurrus as their companion, I actually have kept 1 or 2 of these in, just because I know that it will have a target throughout the game. I think the only problem with this card in that matchup is just the fact that it's occupying a card in your hand in that matchup. It's not so much that it doesn't have an impact, it's that you have to wait for that impact, and while you're waiting, it's in your hand. And, that's the opportunity cost of playing anything that has conditional effects. That's not something inherent of, ECD. That's just kind of where we are with Magic cards. I want to talk really quickly about the anti-aggro cards in this deck, as kind of key card 3, if that's okay, because I think Glass Casket and Shadow the Sky are pretty important to the fact that this deck still does occupy some percentage in this metagame.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Glass Casket is Glass Casket is the reason that this deck can survive against aggro decks, in my opinion. Because it is so important to shut down some of those 2 drops right away, or even 3 drops. Like, the Mammoth is a problem because once you put a cleave on that thing, it is terrifying. Brushfire Elementals, are terrifying, especially in pairs. So being able to get one of those under a glass casket early on is very important, or even something as simple as like an Edgewall Innkeeper, getting that off the battlefield so your opponent can't just start drawing cards right away in the game, and you're finding yourself having to respond to threats constantly and just not keeping up. So
Sometimes it blows my mind that we get things like Glass Casket when we had things like Journey to Nowhere at common for like free. It's like, man, Journey to Nowhere wasn't even playable. People didn't even play it. Anyway.
I mean, I will say I've seen people playing main deck shredded sails at this point to kill things like Glass Casket.
It's true. Okay, so I think we kind of covered the big stuff. I think we actually already mentioned some of my favorite interactions. I was going to mention the Urion play, not Urion, the Thirst discard Dream Trawler play. What are some other cool interactions that we might have missed before we kind of move on to the sideboard?
I know I mentioned the Skyclave apparition play. Sometimes there's sometimes some really interesting decisions to blink a Maze Mind Tome, and try to get more value off that. I've noticed sometimes I've played a Yori and I haven't blinked it because I valued getting the 4 life sooner rather than later. But
me too.
In control matchups, sometimes I can get my Maze Mind Tome up to 3 and just use like that third one as a scry, and then bring the Yorion in to blink it and get to reset it completely. And so I don't know how crazy cool of an interaction that is, but it's at least something really interesting to think about. And
I think
like a card like
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I interrupted you.
A card like Glasspool Mimic is also a pretty neat one of them in the stack where, maybe in situations where it's just like not very good, you get to have it function as a land, or maybe when you're desperate for lands early on, it functions as a land. But it's pretty busted making a copy of Dream Trawler for 3 mana.
That's the one I was going to mention. Is like I had a game where I got to play a Dream Trawler, and Dream Trawler is so hard to kill that I was able to just play the Glasspool Mimic as a second Dream Trawler with Counterspell Magic up, and my opponent was like, nice, concede. I'm just like, yeah, this is it. So yeah, I agree. Let's talk about the sideboard really quick. We mentioned the cards already. I have a question for you. What matchups do you bring in Giant Killer against? Because I just realized yesterday that I should be bringing that in against Rakdos. Because I lost to Rakdos and then played against Rakdos again and was like, wait a second, I should be bringing in Giant Killer. Am I crazy? Is that not what the card the matchup's for?
Yeah, Giant Killer is very, very good against Rakdos. Obviously, you got to deal with those Croxas. But, also, this originally was a 1 of in my sideboard, and now it's a 2 of because I was expecting an uptick of Gruul. And, sometimes you Wrath and then you have to deal with that Questing Beast the next turn. So just having another answer, and then also something to tap down, like those, a Mammoth. Tapping down a Mammoth can be huge because, your opponent's not going to have land drops forever necessarily.
I was tapping down Rankles with it. That was really powerful to be able to tap down Rankle during their attack step, because the thing is that they aren't able to play that second Rankle to get around it, because then it will just kill the first Rankle. They still don't get to attack. And that was quite good. I got a Killer Croxa tap down Rankle. That was powerful. I do think that you have to be able to deal with things at instant speed when you're playing against Embercleave against Gruul, and so I do think that Giant Killer is really important in that regard.
Yeah, it's a great card. My biggest downside to it is that the chop down portion of that card does cost 3 mana, and sometimes just sequencing your plays to be able to pay the 3 for it, I have found it a little tough in some spots.
Yeah. So you actually wrote kind of a not really a guide, but like a kind of a look at this, and I'm just going to kind of read from this, and we can talk about it. But against aggro, you bring in Giant Killer. I assume that it's a green deck or Rakdos, not so much against mono red. Shatter, which is now in the main deck. Baneslayer Angel and Dream Trawler. I gotta say, I was so glad you had Baneslayer Angel. That card is so good against Gruul. Like, Like,
Oh, it is.
especially if people are playing the deal 4 to a flyer instead of other ways to kill flyers right now, because then you're just like, okay, deal 4 to my Baneslayer Angel, let's go.
Well, I found out the hard way that Shatter Skull smashing for 5 does kill it. I was sitting there tanking on a play yesterday, and I like cast my Baneslayer Angel. I'm like, there's no way they can deal with this. And then Shatter Skull smashing for 5. I'm like, oh, well, I guess that was a way they could deal with this.
Sure.
I've actually had a lot of like, I've been debating like bringing in an Archon of Sun.
The 4 mana card.
The 4 mana, the Pegasus.
Yeah, I think that it's funny you say that, because I do think that that's occupied in your sideboard a little bit by Felidar Retreat.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Yeah, go ahead. What were you going to say about that?
So yeah, I kind of run into this problem with this card. So I'm not against a lot of matchups. I'm taking out Shark Typhoon, which cuts down my enchantments that are in the deck, or I'm taking out ECDs, which also cuts down my enchantments in the deck. I have this card Felidar Retreat, which does a lot of the things that the Archon does, but is better against rogues than the Archon is. And also, you know, there's Dream Trawler, which is kind of like Archon in some ways, but Dream Trawler is a significantly harder card to deal with than Archon. So I've been kind of all over the place with that one. And I think Baneslayer against like Rule is just in general a better card than Archon because of the power, the 2 power.
Yeah, I think the differences are, you know, where you sit against rogues and where you sit against mono red. And I think since you already have a good mono red matchup, you don't really need Archon. So it's kind of tough. I do like, you know, where this deck sits. You know, you talked about boarding out ECD depending on the matchup, boarding out a Tome, maybe some Typhoons. You know, the thing is against aggro that what you're looking for is to shave specific cards for specific matchups. So like, for me, like boarding out 2 Tomes is a thing that I've been doing. And I agree with you. I think that you have so much, and the metagame's so open that it's hard to decide what quote unquote hard to deal with threat or threat that diversifies your board makes sense in the metagame.
Yeah.
Against control, you bring in the extra Shark Typhoon, the extra Epiphany, the retreats, the negates. I mean, against the control decks, other control decks, you know, you have pretty easy board outs, right? Like Shadow the Sky is not very good, depending on the control deck. Glass Casket's not very good, and then at that point, you've really streamlined your deck.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, Glass Casket sometimes, you know, if I know they're a Shark deck, Glass Casket has a little bit higher value than something like Shatter the Sky. You know, if I know they're a deck that's maybe trying to fill the board, I might consider leaving a couple Shatters in. You know, I've really been trying to figure out how to play that Esper Doom matchup, since that's definitely going to be becoming more relevant. And I believe I left in 1 Shatter versus them.
I've been leaving in 1 Shatter against rogues just to like, you know, have a thing. I actually wondered about. It was funny. I had a moment. I was like, man, I wonder if I wish that I had an Ugin for this matchup. And I was like, wait a second, Ugin costs 8 mana. I don't wish that at all.
Yeah, I will consider like the 2 Shatters for like 2 Shatters, maybe even 2 to 3 Shatters versus rogues, really depending on the build. If they're really creature reliant and they're like really going, you know, in on having crabs, I think Shatters definitely a consideration.
Sure. One of the things that is also different from your list than Zach's is you've got the glimpses in the sideboard, whereas he had some in the main deck. When you talk to me about Glimpse, when do you bring that in? That card is way better than I thought it was going to be.
Okay, Glimpse is this card is just like it just screams rogues, like because what's something that's really really important versus rogues is being able to, you know, they're trying to manipulate your graveyard in their favor so that they can make these Into the Stories cheaper, which Into the Story is like, that's the card that is truly the problem from, you know, your side of things if the rogue player cast it, because they just get to refill their hand and get ahead on card advantage.
That's actually, by the way, she's absolutely right. That is why I lost so much the first time, is like I was trying to get them out of resources and then just win the game, and I would end up like tapping out for a Dream Trawler, and then all of a sudden like sick Into the Story. I'm like, oh, did I just make a mistake? And then I would end up losing, and I'm like, okay. this game is actually not about getting them out of resources. It's about not letting them resolve into the story. And
Do not, yeah,
I did
do
not
not
realize
let
that
them draw
going
that
in.
many cards.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but yeah, so what Glimpse does really, really well is it. I mean, you want to keep your hand full versus rogues. You want to have as many resources as possible. So Glimpse, you're drawing cards. You're getting resources. But with this escape that it has on it, you're also manipulating what is in your, what's in your graveyard so that you can keep your graveyard below that 7 or 8 card count, whichever it is. There's like different counts on the rogue cards, which throws me off every single time. But yeah, keeping your graveyard at a low count so that the rogue player, doesn't get pumped on, creatures, doesn't get to cast their Into the Story for cheaper. That's all super relevant.
One of the things that I noticed about your list, and I'd love to talk about this kind of before we wrap up, is no Banishing Lights. Is that a conscious thing? Is it just something that you don't think there's room for? Like, what are your thoughts around that card?
It's a card I looked at. I could see it possibly having a place, but a lot of times Skyclave Apparitions
just does the impression anyway.
Yeah, it's doing what you need the Banishing Light to do. And I think, a lot of the decks that are going to play things that you would want to target with the Banishing Light are going to have answers to that Banishing Light.
Sure.
Very easily. So it kind of feels bad to, like, I don't know, Banishing Light a Ugin or an ECD just to have
it.
it.
ECD? Sure.
Yeah. Or Ugin, like.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I think that, one of the things about this deck specifically is, you kind of had some stuff listed for mid-range. We already talked about rogues a little bit, but this deck has a lot of options against any style of mid-range deck, from the Felidar Retreats, from the Giant Killer, is that what it's called? From Sublime Epiphany, from Shark Typhoon, like, you certainly are the bigger deck. You're supposed to win those matchups, and it is about tuning your deck in the sideboard games to kind of line up against what your opponent's doing.
Yep. Yeah. And, Felidar's Retreat was like a card that I had decided to add to the sideboard before the prior qualifier weekend, when I was, like, I pulled this list off Twitter, right? And I was looking at the sideboard. I'm like, I really feel like Felidar Retreat is just a card that can just do a lot with, in this deck. And it's hard. It's not an easy card to answer for a lot of decks too, especially like rogues. It's not easy for them to answer.
Yeah, I really enjoyed my time playing this deck this week, Michaela, and kind of preparing for this episode. I had an interesting week at work, so I was planning on playing the SCG this weekend and wasn't able to, and then just had one of the best days of my life yesterday. So I was glad I didn't play. But is there anything else you want to say about this deck before we wrap up? Anything that, I guess we haven't really said, like, Michaela, you played this deck yesterday. Are you going to continue tuning this and playing this as time goes on? Or are you going to try some other things right now in Standard? Like, where do you think this deck sits for you?
Well, so right now, my plan for Standard is to take 1 to 2 hours over the next week and just try to really understand more decks and what's going on. I've played a small amount of just about of most of the decks that are out there right now. But this is the reason I've been playing this personally, is I feel like it has game against everything. And I picked up the deck, I started playing, and I'm like, I understand what I'm doing. The learning curve on this deck for me personally was very low, which was something that I personally needed because I had not been playing a lot of Standard.
Sure.
So I was gonna say, since I do plan on playing more Standard this week, this may not be the deck that I choose next weekend. Sure. Although maybe I come to the conclusion that I think it's going to be well positioned. And
I think that for me, there's a lot of things in Standard going on right now, but I do think that with Green really becoming what I think is the best deck, like, unquestionably, I think Gruul as best deck A, and then offshoots of that deck being decks that are reasonable choices, I do think some kind of blue-white shell is something that can be explored. So I don't disagree with you. I think there's a lot to explore in the standard. It's really open. We talked about that last week, but I hope that this episode helped people understand what this deck is trying to do, where you can go with this deck, and I had a lot of fun this week, Michaela, so thank you so much for sharing your experience with the deck.
Yes. Thank you.
If you want to support the show, don't forget to check out our sponsor over at Pure Empty Joe. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button if you are watching on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast, leave us a review. It helps so much. And thank you, everybody, so much for listening. We will see everybody next week with another episode of Arena Mythicast.